resuming recording. Okay, so I'm gonna give everybody one more minute because we should have a couple more folks. And then we will jump in because we have lots of fun content to get through today. And I'm excited. It seems like we have got a lot of brand new Fundraising Friday folk. There are names I am not recognizing, which is a good thing. Can you give me a thumbs up if it's your first Fundraising Friday? Angie, and tell me if I butcher your name. Is it Orsolia?
Yep, you got it.
Awesome. And Jay,
Welcome.
Yes, welcome to everybody. Newbies and alums. Okay, guys, let's get started. We know that our Fundraising Friday attendance once we hit June, things can get a little slow, a little crazy. I know it's heavy graduation weeks here as well. We've had all of our graduations here in Florida, but I know some of my northern counterparts that is happening this week. So, and welcome Caitlin, good to see you. So today we are going to be talking about the nonprofit industrial complex. This was not originally part of our curriculum plan, but this was a special request from our attendees. So I expected this one to be heavily downloaded. We're going to do this in two parts. So our lecture today, and I say lecture loosely because we'd like to keep it very casual here for those of you who are new to Fundraising Friday. So we're going to talk about sort of what is the nonprofit industrial complex, why do we need to know about it and be aware of it, and how to sort of top line navigate it as a nonprofit practitioner. And then when we do our second session on this later in the month, we'll actually get into a deep dive peer discussion on where is it our responsibility as fundraisers to challenge where the complex is upholding inequity, how do we really examine our roles in it, and we'll get into the stickier parts of the discussion. So that is what's on tap for today. I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Bethany Mackey. I am the Executive Director here at Progressive Multiplier. I have with me Polly Stamatopoulos, who is our Senior Director of Movement Group Engagement and runs all things training, helping our grantees out, helping our strategic partners out. You may also see our three other colleagues, Violetta, Andrea, and Lisa, come in from time to time. They often like to fly on the wall our training so that they can hear from you guys on what's of interest. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if we can be a partner or a service. So here at Progressive Multiplier, we are a funding intermediary and we fund fundraising experiments for progressive groups. So we fund groups in 3 different program areas: achieving justice, realizing democracy, and restoring the environment. So if you are a group in one of those areas and you do work that goes beyond direct service or is focused on systemic change, advocacy, litigation, get out the vote work, all of that good stuff, and you're interested in potentially working with Progressive Multiplier as a funder, please don't hesitate to reach out to Polly or myself. Our emails are in the appointment, and we would be happy to talk to you about those opportunities. Our partnership that brings us here today is with the Resilience Initiative and the Leaders Trust. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Resilience Initiative reached out to us to be the sort of fundraising help desk for all of originally Just Packard Foundation's grantees. That group has since grown to about almost 500 groups that are within the Resilience Initiative. And we also are partners with the Leaders Trust and supporting their Flexible Leadership Award winners. So that is what brings us to the table today. As I mentioned, if you haven't, please introduce yourself, name, organization, title in the chat, just so that we can know who's doing what and pull you into the conversation well. We do record these sessions and make both the recordings and the PDFs available. So there is a portal on the Resilience Initiative website password protected. This is a really safe space. We have very candid conversations. These are not things we put on our own marketing or YouTube channels. These are all within the Resilience Initiative portal. So please don't hesitate to have the candid conversations. Outside of Fundraising Fridays, we also, as part of this partnership, offer one-on-one coaching. So you can sign up for a block of 5 hours with us. You can sign up for multiple blocks of 5 hours with us, and we will help you through whatever fundraising revenue generation project is on your mind. For some folks, that's been they just needed somebody to riff with. Some folks have needed full development planning. Some folks have needed staff planning. Some people have needed board training. Some folks we've worked with on a campaign. So whatever you want, consider it like phone a fundraiser. And we are here to help. Next year, and for us, next year starts next month in July. We are likely going to include a third offering, which is going to be more sort of office hours, where we will hold time and people can just call us for the more random questions that come up versus the intense one-on-one coaching consultations. So if you have any ideas that you'd like to see us bake into this partnership, we're all ears. Always reach out to us with what you think you guys are interested in. So I'm going to turn it over to Polly as our training lead here, because we are now faced with coming up with our curriculum for July through December, and we want to make sure it is on point for what you want. So Polly.
Hi, everybody. I'm Polly Stamatopoulos. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you so much. For those of you who have been around, you know that I used to be just a fangirl of this week, and now I get to co-facilitate with Bethany. So this is I'm still brand new, clearly. So be gentle, but I'd love to hear your any critiques or suggestions for how I can make this time more efficient and effective for everyone. But I do want to hear about what your ideas are for July through December as we plan out the curriculum. Hit me up on email. You can throw it in the chat. We'll capture it all, or speak up. Somebody have an idea?
Hey, Kate.
Oh, all right.
Kate, was that an accidental unmute? Totally fine.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No biggie. You had us all excited. We thought somebody was going to throw out an idea.
But you can if you want. Otherwise, just hit me up later or throw it in the chat. Whatever you need, whatever your thoughts are, we'd love to get them down on paper and see what we can work out.
And just to give folks context, since we have a lot of new folks on the phone, we have done sessions on storytelling, donor acquisition, donor retention, mid-major and planned giving. We are always happy to revisit a topic. We are always happy to design new. I know something that is of interest to a lot of our grantee partners right now is digging into multi-entity fundraising of how do you set up fundraising for across a C3 and a C4. Trauma-informed storytelling has really been a hot topic among our grantees as well, in terms of in this sort of weird late stage pandemic, getting into election season, all of the insane things that are happening. How do we tell and align with sort of the national vibe ethically? So really, anything you guys want, we will do. And please throw your ideas in the chat, because you do not want Polly and I going uninformed into curriculum development. God knows what we will come up with. All right. Polly, do you want to just take it from here?
Sure will. So what we're going to go through is, this is our quick agenda. So first I'm going to start off talking about sort of centering this conversation around me, because I can't help myself, but from a historical context of philanthropy. Then we'll roll into what is the nonprofit industrial complex, name it, define it, so we all have that shared language. Then we'll go into the more structural and social history of nonprofit sector, how that built the nonprofit industrial complex, why that matters today, and then we're going to figure out how we can navigate this as practitioners, so that how we can navigate through it, around it, and not participate in it. So what are the things that you want to learn to make sure that if we can add some context as we go, we can do that. So what do folks want to hear? What do you think of when people say nonprofit industrial complex? And for new folks, you can totally popcorn, take yourself off mute, just jump in with any comments. If you want to raise your hand or throw it in the chat, that's good too. Steve?
Start, Paul. Yeah, when I think of it, I think of mostly the norm of nonprofit management and leadership, the ways that we kind of get socialized into nonprofits that are trying to merge our values, but with a lot of sometimes corporate quote unquote best practices. Also, we're trying to really look at it through the lens of culture of white supremacy. But I think I've been rereading some of the earlier critiques of the nonprofit structure as almost like what was developed by philanthropy as a way of, in some ways, avoiding kind of the more reckoning of reparations and redistributing wealth. And so like the decades of how our nonprofit organizations have tried to work on conditions, tried to create more equitable systems, but at the same time, operate as a stopgap for the ways in which wealth is still concentrated and keeps perpetuating the inequities. So
we did a lot of that thinking too when we were building this deck. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve said, as well as what Ursulia put in the chat. It's I think I've had a bit of a career journey now. I'm a full-time fundraiser, and periodically I'm like, what am I doing? I'm part of the system. And yeah, I think, just sort of like every time I'm bending over backwards to talk to a single wealthy person, it just feels like it's hard. And so I'm really curious to talk about like how to operate in that, operate within the constraints of where we're currently at, while still maintaining your progressive values. And how can you recognize the system, work to change the system, and sort of all of that. But yeah, I guess just to sort of say, really excited. I was really excited to see that this was a topic for discussion.
Thanks, Kate. And yes, especially for those of you who are newer to Fundraising Friday, consider this an ad hoc support group for fundraisers, because especially during the last couple of years, whether it is the nonprofit industrial complex or the forever shifting landscape of, disaster-driven fundraising or rage-driven philanthropy, or all of our institutional funders changing their strategies, all of those things, we're all coming up against a lot of the same universal stressors. So we try to hold this space for each other. So don't ever hesitate, as Kate has been, to be candid about just some of the ish that we have to get through.
Anybody else wanna give their thoughts about this before we launch in?
James, that's a good one in the chat in terms of loaded administration. All right. Spot on, Angie.
Yeah, Angie, I feel that. Thinking about a bunch of people with zero relevant experience weighing in on what is best for community members. Lots of I alone can fix this thinking out there. So I'm a proud Greek American. My parents both came from Greece, and a part of growing up, philanthropy is just baked in. So I don't know if any of you saw this really beautifully done, thoughtful documentary that came out a couple years ago called My Big Fat Greek Wedding. If you had, then you may understand how we Greek people have an affinity for and are way extra when it comes to talking about our own history. And so this is my extra Greek moment just for you. Yeah, Gus and Vula would be proud for me to mention my Greek roots at this moment. All right, so who is this dude and why does he matter to this conversation about philanthropy? Ancient Greek mythology, Prometheus bound. Prometheus was attacked for helping people. So philanthropy, the Prometheus bound is basically where we think the idea of philanthropy came from. So it comes from the Greek word philanthropia, which comes from love of people or humanity. So phileo and anthropo. You can't do a conversation about philanthropy without defining the term. And I dusted off my Greek accent just for you guys. So as the legend goes, is that Zeus, not so much of a fan of of human people, was like, I'm just going to wipe them out. We're going to start all over again. Prometheus was a Titan before the Greek gods that folks are sort of aware of. And he was like, you know what? I like these human things. They're sort of cool. They just need a little help. So I'm going to give them fire and I'm going to give them hope. And these were metaphors for like all the things. So, fire really represented like skill, technology, science, art, education, and hope was really just about like, we can do this. Like he wanted the human race to feel supported and like that they could persevere with these new tools that they were now had access to that didn't have before. And Zeus was like, dude, that sucks. We don't want these, like, we want humanity to go away. So he was, he was chained to a rock and all these horrible things happen. But why I think it's important to sort of start there is because I also think of philanthropy and the work that we do is like we bring our fire and our hope to our work every day. And at the end of the day, whether you feel like you're involved in this nonprofit industrial complex that feels bad, just go back to where this came from 2,500 years ago, to this fire and passion of knowledge and this hope of humanity, and let's just try to do it a little bit different, or maybe more original in our thinking about it. So where ancient Greeks through history and through history believe that philanthropia lives is like it's a state of being where you give, you're productive, you benefit others. And in fact, even today, we have a thing called philotimo, which is clearly, you hear the same words, right? Is like when you act up, your parents might say like, where's your philotimo? Where is your pride in helping people? What are you doing with your life that is benefiting people? So we are still bound to that in every part of our sort of being. And so I put this out there as a way to also just sort of frame it. Like philanthropy really, from its roots, is about like a core belief in humanity. And if you call yourself a progressive, if you call yourself something else, I hope that you have a core belief in humanity or you wouldn't be doing this stuff, right? But how did it go from like this core belief to systems? Well, people are part of systems. So people, emperors gave tax exempt statuses to hospitals. So we helped each other. We were benevolent, we were giving, we were charitable. Then we put systems in place like tax exemptions to hospitals and orphanages. And as societies evolved, all of that other baggage that we bring with it created strata and classes and systems, and all of that got built into how we demonstrate or perform philanthropy. So it became a tool of the dominant class. The more you had, the more you can give, the more you could give, the more people were appreciative, the more they were appreciative, the more you can make them dance to do things. And then that created sort of like you could sort of see how that organically, unfortunately, was baked into the cake. So sorry, this is where Bethany's taking over, right?
I can. And for those of you who, as I say, are new, I used to do Fundraising Friday solo. And since Polly joined us a month ago, now we are team teaching. So we're still getting our handoffs right. But so, we start literally at the beginning, ancient Greece, the love of humanity and serving humankind. And lots of thousands of years of humaning, we end up with the nonprofit industrial complex in this country. And I wanted to call out this quote of, the nonprofit industrial complex is dirty business. Don't let it get your heart, because we need you for the struggle. And I think that is what our team espouses and what I put out with love to all the folks on the call here today. So when we've defined philanthropy, let's define the nonprofit industrial complex. So we see it as the system of relationships between 5 levels: the government level, including local, state, and federal; the capitalist market and system. So everything in our country is sort of capitalist rooted. And we could have an entire year-long conversation on that. But we want to say government, capitalist market, foundations, the nonprofit and NGO direct services through direct action organizations. You'll see, we'll go over this in a little more detail in a second, but we see the nonprofit groups on a continuum from those who provide direct service all the way through those who provide direct action. And you don't have to live at one spot. You can likely take up a big chunk of that continuum. Everybody defines their work differently. But it matters that we see that continuum in how the government sees it, from C3 to C4 and PAC and all of the other tax designations, because it affects how we have cultivated donors in this country and how we work through our mission delivery. And then the last one are the businesses that support all of these elements in their philanthropic pursuits. So when we think of, I came from a big agency, so we used to sell my time for pushing $300 an hour at a 60% margin to nonprofits. There's a reason I'm here now. I was part of that business. So Kate, when you talk about being part of the complex, I have seen it from the dirtiest corners of it. Also think about all of those vendors that we use, all of the Act Blues and Nation Builders and Blackbauds and Salsas. And so any of those businesses, software companies, consultants, the folks we hire to do our 990s, our audits, our state fundraising registrations, those are also part of this complex. Any questions there? Everybody on the same page about the sort of 5 spokes of the complex? All right. And thank you for the thumbs up. I truly appreciate it. I'm a very nervous public speaker, and I'm always like, oh, am I screwing up? So I appreciate any feedback. Even though I do this 4 times a month, it has never made a dent in the nervousness. So I want to talk a little bit about the structural and social history of our sector. We've talked about the history of philanthropy. Now let's talk about our sector, because what started out as love of humankind and service to humanity, when we put it into systems, turns into something a little bit different. So I want to do a definition check on what a system is. So we think of a system as a collection of parts or elements that are connected in a way to adhere into some kind of whole. We're talking about it in this context as systems of privilege. And when we think about privilege, that could be family, workplace, society, government. It is a system of people and entities that work together. A system is always organized, when you're talking about humans, around 3 basic principles: dominance, identification, and centeredness. So depending on what system you are a part of, like in your family, when you think about your family system, what do you define as dominant? What do you center as values? Those sorts of things. When you think about a workplace, like Progressive Multiplier is very intentional about the system we co-design in what we center. And we are incredibly centered on equity and meeting our employees where they are in their learning journeys and in their race equity journeys and that kind of thing. So when we think about this with the nonprofit industrial complex and why it and the progressive movement are not generally great partners, is that the progressive movement as a system centers, we basically work to center the non-centered and work towards equitable paths towards equal opportunity for all. That is what progressives do for a living and in their souls. Anybody want to push back on me on that, or does that feel right to everybody in terms of defining how we work as a system?
You're talking about the last bullet point?
Yep. Steve, does that feel right to you?
Yeah, I guess you're talking about the progressive part of nonprofits.
The movement in general, whether it is they are movement groups or funders or vendors or local governments that are more progressive in nature. I live in St. Pete, Florida, and we are probably one of the like 2 tiny little progressive dots on the map in our state. But it's important to sort of, when we talk about why a lot of folks on this call probably run into some conflict with the system that is the nonprofit industrial complex, because it is at odds with the system of the progressive ecosystem and what it centers. All right, so here's why systems become important. For any of our Hamilton fans or musical fans or Broadway buffs or theater geeks, as our alumni interns here at Progressive Multiplier, this is King George from Hamilton. We can't forget that we have colonial roots. So our system of how we basically laid the foundation for how we deal with the nonprofits in this country is a British blueprint. So as far back as 1601, the Statute of Charitable Uses basically provided the skeleton. And I'm calling this out because you are going to see as early as the 1600s, when we took this blueprint in the 1700s for the US, this feels very C3. When we think about what we consider as charitable, aged, impotent, poor people, sick and maimed soldiers, my personal favorite, the marriage of poor maids, relief or redemption of prisoners. So it has that we are taking care of the invalid in our society. So it leans, even before C3 was a thing, even before direct service was a defined thing, this is where that comes from, and that bias towards direct service work in the system. Any questions there? All right. So, true to its colonial roots, the US, literally from its inception, never prioritized fully funding the social safety net. Charitable groups were literally designed and defined by the government to fill this gap. The social safety net, by its very nature, addresses the problems of things like race-rooted inequality. So you're making a social safety net to literally solve for the problems of the societal system that you just set up. So if you look back here, when we think about what are the problems that we set up in taking this as our blueprint, we don't center or value aged, poor, sick, orphans, prisoners. Is all this sounding familiar? So that is why the social safety net was created. The government put together a legal framework in the 1800s the US government, the baby government, for organizations to essentially trade tax exemptions for doing the work that the government defined as benefiting the public. They did this as a cost-saving measure. We don't think about that when we think about why was the social safety net created. It wasn't just we don't care about the poor, sick, infirmed, et cetera. It is also to actually fully fund a social safety net to take care of the non-centered parts of our citizenry. It would take a ridiculous amount of money. And when you think about where we were time-wise as a country here, you are talking about you know, a baby government less than 50 years old. It didn't have its ish together yet. So they saved themselves a lot of money by essentially subcontracting to nonprofits, as well as leaning on them to create this social safety net. This is why we have so many nonprofits that have giant government contracts. Lots of our grantee partners have giant government contracts. There may be some folks, so how many on the phone get government grants for their work? I would assume there are at least a few. You guys still with me out there? Okay. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. All right. So I want to sort of take you through how this evolved over time from then, baby government, to now, and we'll go up to literally current, of how this manifested in terms of the government set up the charitable sector to take care of the non-centered populations and created essentially subcontractors for themselves to provide the social safety net at a fraction of the cost that if it were government provided. So 1894 was the first time we see an actual statute referencing tax exemptions for charitable organizations. So this was when the country was 100 years old, and they actually codified at a federal level. This timeline is from the IRS. You can actually find it on irs.gov. So short of dealing with the states, this is the first time the federal government said, yep, nonprofits are a thing, and we're essentially trading tax exemption for them providing the social safety net. In 1913, things, and 1970, so in 1913, you start getting language in our tax code where you see a difference between C3 and C4. Now, when we think of C4s today, we think more of civic action organizations. Yes, 100% Steve. So C4 organizations are what we would call the precursor to C4 organizations in 1930, were more membership organizations, Freemasons, things like that. This was not necessarily advocacy organizations, but there was a concern as far back as 1913 that groups of people organizing needed to be treated differently, that they weren't necessarily the same kind of nonprofit as those who were taking care of the old and the infirmed. 1917 was the real sort of linchpin difference of, because for the very first time, the income tax code changed drastically to pay for World War I. So the income tax revenue the budget in 1970 was greater than the federal budget had been since the inception of the country combined. So if you took what it cost to run the country from 1776 through the early 1900s, when World War I happened, that cost became exponential. And this was where, because wealthy citizens were now being taxed at a much higher rate, and the tax actually went far deeper into the population, this was the first time that individual income tax deduction for charitable donations became a thing. And this is why, because all of a sudden they tax everybody and they tax the wealthy a lot. So it's sort of the opposite of what we have now, and that the wealthy were paying a huge portion of income tax. So this is where we start adding, when we talk about what we saw in ancient Greece, this is where we have reintroduced that whole sort of very public giving piece and actually codified it into law for the wealthy. You'll see as we go on through the 30s and we're sort of, post crash of 29, pre-World War II, you're starting to see more stuff around lobbying and corporate tax deductions as the economy matures, and as lobbying in the labor movement matures. So when you think about like the height of factory age and things like that, that's where you start seeing those pushbacks against organizing reflected in the tax code. 1954 is when C3s and C4s were born. It was the first time we see that 501c designation for all of the different numbers that come after it, and the first true limit on political activities as pertains to nonprofits. Note that date, 1954, what was simmering and brewing in 1954? Civil rights movement exploded, late 50s, early 60s, and you see this rapid growth in the charitable sector. So this is where you sort of went from in the C3 category, aged, infirmed, et cetera, to you now have this whole newly, I don't want to say empowered, that's the wrong word, activated population to serve a much broader, this was no longer just about, housing the homeless and feeding the poor. This was about taking care of a different need in the nation. So you have this huge growth in the charitable sector. And we could teach an entire degree program on this slide and the societal implications. So please forgive me for the high level. I know that if we put the lens of what did this mean to the Native population in the US at the time, the Black population, women, like we could put every lens to this and tell a much more nuanced, deeper story. But just to give you the sort of what's the skeleton and the initial layer of meat on the complex, this is the understanding. So as I say, forgive me that I'm not giving this nearly what the intricacy it should have. So after the 54 and in the 60s, so through the 60s and 70s, we saw huge growth in the nonprofit sector. And in the late 60s, early 70s is where nonprofit business became a thing, because it's where we now have private foundation rules. So that is when we started with our 5% payouts from foundations. It is where we started getting all kinds of different limits on, deeper limits on political activities. And it's then where we start to see that proliferation of the businesses surrounding the sector. So when we think about the birth of the nonprofit sector, it is really 1969, early 70s, when there was this significant tax reform act around foundations. So the next big thing that I see, obviously all of these things matter, but the thing that then really happens, so the code just keeps post 1969, the code gets tweaked annually every 5 years. There's, every few years there is something that changes in the tax code that affects our world. Like it was, what is the minimum standard deduction and everything was the latest. But the next big thing in this timeline that actually rocked our world was not a code, it was a Supreme Court ruling. And that was sort of the next layer. And Steve, yes, war on poverty, totally. That is when you saw in that response to the civil rights movement and media coming of age, broadcast media, that you now had a totally different America, everyday American citizens had a very different lens on need in this country. And you saw response both from the nonprofit sector, the faith sector, and the government. So all of that is part of that tremendous sort of like 1960s boom of the sector. As I say, that's one of the things, like I would kill to teach a class on all of this. We could do that like it's like the history class for next year. So Citizens United versus FEC was what I think one of the most painful bricks in the nonprofit industrial complex. So this was the Supreme Court ruling that essentially allowed corporations to make electioneering communications. So this was the floodgates that opened up dark money in politics. So this is again one of those structural pieces that allows someone, a donor, to amass power through wealth and control the means of political production. So this is another piece of the sort of code and law that affects our world and where money comes from. So
Real quick,
go ahead,
I
Polly,
think that
sorry.
one of the things that's really that really struck me when I was doing my research on this was that up between the 1950s and the 1980s, when we started to see the right turn in some of the legislation that happened around nonprofits, 60% of nonprofit organizations were outwardly fighting for civil rights. They were doing a lot more lobbying. They were trying to agitate for civil rights, specifically fighting for African Americans, the traditional definition of the civil rights movement, but also Mexican Americans inclusion and immigration, specifically immigration rights specifically for Mexican Americans or Mexican peoples. That was like completely unpalatable to the power structure. And then we've got huge clampdowns on activity. And that's why I think that there's like this there was this huge pop, this huge growth, and then this drastic right turn that happened in the 80s during the Reagan administration.
Yep. Yeah, spot on, Polly. So we can't scalpel apart sort of the national sentiment and how it then manifests in our tax code that rules our world as nonprofit fundraisers. So as much as we'd like to, so to bottom line this and sort of taking all of these pieces down, what does this mean for how these rules against our capitalist background have baked themselves into the fabric of our nonprofit work? So we know, number one, charity is incentivized over investment in societal benefit in a way that perpetuates structural injustices that are baked into our country's fabric from colonialism. So when we talk about like white saviorism and all of those things, that falls into that bucket. And someone said it on the chat that this is, you know, we have literally baked the bad stuff into the foundation. And that's part of our struggle with the complex today. The other piece, sort of the second bucket that I see of these codes plus our capitalist society, when we talk about that critical private foundation rule that came up in 1969, it sort of like put the stake in the ground that wealth didn't need to be redistributed for the social good, and that defining social good was in the hands of people other than the directly affected. And I think somebody had mentioned that in the chat. So this is literally where we can take these and pin them back to the laws that created those cracks. Giving the third bucket that I see is giving money to nonprofits as an individual or a corporation can give you political power that suppresses the will of the greatest number of people. We actually work with several statewide hubs for democracy, where they're building permanent democracy infrastructure, and a lot of them are working on ranked choice voting and things like that. And it is fascinating, disheartening, angering, all of those things to see actually trace the money from major donors, to buy media, the means of political production for candidates who can then, because they've activated a minority base, and by I mean minority in number, that they can literally suppress the will of the people. So the fourth piece, and this fourth and fifth are where this comes down to us and where I'll start handing it over to Polly, is we have tough choices to make about maximizing revenue by giving into the expectation of donor delight. We're operating completely within our mission and values. Steve, I think it was you brought up the white supremacy piece of that. That is a huge piece of this. And then we have choices to make about our legal structures to make sure that we have all of the legal entities we need to accomplish our missions, which makes our life a little more complicated. Usually means we need to tap into that vendor spoke of the complex a little bit more. But those are where those two things come to us. Okay, 200 years of history in 10 minutes or less. Thoughts, pushback, questions? Things you'd like to dig deeper into at a later session, since we do have our call in 2 weeks on this? All right, we got a quiet crowd here this afternoon. Thanks, Angie. Okay. So some of the challenges of the industrial complex that you're going to face as a nonprofit. So I'm glad we included this slide. We have used this one before. It was a lot, 10 minutes. I apologize. We could easily make these so much longer. We do have the recordings in the PDFs available. And we're also available for offline chats or if there's anything you guys want to dig in deeper. So the challenge that we face, challenge number one, as we've hinted at, is that C3 work and giving is prioritized over C4 work. It is built into the structure. It is built into how we incent our donors. And here's how that lays out. And please don't take this continuum to think that we love C3 organizations more than C4s or C4s more than C3s. But when you think about this from a donor motivation standpoint, since we're all fundraisers, what you see in those big blue blocks is what a donor sees in the nonprofit. What am I giving to? And Samuel, thank you. We try to keep it meaty here, meaty and quick on our sessions. So when we think about the left side of the spectrum and direct service, these are all groups that I give to personally. And I firmly believe that they are all needed in the ecosystem, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about what our responsibilities are across the ecosystem a little bit later in terms of, Kate, I think you asked, what could you do? So C3s tend to operate within current power systems. They are there to react to the current system and give a person, we always say, help, hope, and support, and create the conditions for individual change. So Metro Inclusive Health is the LGBTQ healthcare provider here in St. Pete. They do amazing work. They are there to make sure that trans affirming care is available for trans teenagers here, but they are not doing anything to change the horrific-ish that's happening in Governor DeSantis's office. They are taking care of the kid who needs gender-affirming healthcare. From direct service, we also then go to individual behavior change organizations. So RARE is a nonprofit out of DC, and they are providing resources for people who want to change their the way they interact with the natural world to be more environmentally restorative and preserving. So again, fantastic work. They aren't trying to change the laws. They're trying to say, here is an individual as an agent of change. The sort of middle of the power continuum and the change continuum, I think, are education nonprofits. And I don't mean education, I know we often have like Ed Trust West and some of those crews on the phone. I mean groups that are literally there to educate our citizenry. So Texas After Violence Project is an archivist nonprofit, and they collect the stories of individuals and families who have been the victims of state-sponsored violence. And they then turn around those stories and educate lawyers that work in the capital punishment space, mental health care professionals. So they are there to soften the ground and gain understanding. They are not there to change legislation or policy. They are there to literally change hearts and minds and practices. Then we get into this sort of, we're truly in the C4 space when we're in the advocacy and direct action space. Advocacy folks tend to be multi-entity, have C3 and C4, but they tend to be C3 forward, versus direct action folks tend to be C4 forward. And they have a C3 usually just to catch the foundations that won't give them to their C4. So that's where we're really starting about, you know, changing a system to help a group I align with. I give to Equality Florida because I'm aligned with the work that they do. Direct action groups you are usually changing the system and to align with a group that you aren't part of as a donor. You'll see I have members over there in a separate bucket. That is we could do a deep-based, mass-based conversation. I think I saw a California group that is probably very familiar language. So what we say all this to say that all of this work is needed, but our structure and the industrial complex is very biased towards the left side of it. It's where you get tax deductions. It is where you get government contracts, all the things. That usually means that our direct action folks are left out of a lot of money and a lot of support. Does that make sense? So this is the biggest thing that I think is the challenge. And we'll talk about how to navigate that in a minute. The second challenge that we see that the complex really imposes on us is that how it has conditioned donors, and this is largely the C3 versus C4 thing, and that we have conditioned donors to give help, hope, and support, not to change systems, change policy, provide equitable paths to equal representation and treatment. So, and then this is also where we start dipping into that vendor rung. So if the way to make the most money is to treat your donor as a hero, the organizations that can afford the huge fundraising and marketing budgets to hire agencies like my old agency to get donors to say yes in a very disconnected way from their program effectiveness. When we look at the folks that are billion-dollar nonprofits, sometimes, not always, they are not the best programmatic game in the business. So like St. Jude's, fantastic work. This is not an anti-St. Jude's comment whatsoever. They have probably the largest marketing and fundraising budget among their peers, but they are about 10th when it comes to their program as a children's research and service hospital. So we have made the complex has then way we've trained donors has really disconnected fundraising and program so that fundraising is disconnected from the heart and soul and reason. And it has become a manipulative sort of profession of how do we treat donors as heroes. This is really, to me, the thing, and it is probably the area of most personal shame of I literally have decks in my archives to teach people how to do this. You know, as a fundraiser of almost 25 years, I used to literally give presentations on how to delight your donors. That is a white supremacist concept. You shouldn't delight your donors. Your donors should be your allies. So this is a wall of words, but it I think is an important quote from Vuli's blog, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we have all been taught that it is our job to make our donors feel appreciated and relevant and connected and all of those things. But we have taken it as an industry a little too far in that we have silenced the voices of those affected. So it is not about delighting the donor, it's about softening the ground and getting the donor to invest in those things which the community is defining as that which will advance equity and justice for them. And that is a complete shift in approach. And I think that we as fundraisers, and speaking to the executive directors and the folks who actually run fundraising teams on this call, there have to be metrics that you have to make sure that you are not incenting your staff with just a dollar amount. That ethical fundraising, trauma-informed storytelling in the process of fundraising, that all of those matter. You will make less money. That is a given. And that is the reality that we as fundraisers are faced with. But in order to not be part of the machine, that is something that, that we have to keep in mind. And we have gone so far with some of our grantee partners to actually help them model that out for their boards of, if we stick with standards, here's what we can raise. If we do it a more ethical way, here is what we can raise. Because, and that is about anti-complex as I can get, and keeping it real. Any questions or discussions we want to stop here and have for a second? I know this is a deep, meaty topic, especially, you know, fundraisers of color. We lead a group of a class where we did an entire class on just this topic for BIPOC-led civic engagement groups in the Deep South, where this is a whole different ballgame. So I'd just love if anybody has anything they'd like to dig into here.
Feel free to speak up, y'all.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I hope this just starts it off, but I appreciate the big picture you all been, kind of leading us through the history. And, I think where I'm landing in your big picture is that when we talk about the nonprofit industrial complex and the challenges, I mean, it's also just to recognize that any group that qualifies for 501c3 status is in the nonprofit industrial complex, and hospitals, universities, the NFL, the National Football League, all are huge recipients of that tax deduction. And yet what I'm hearing the next part of this is the challenge for us in a system of maybe you were naming progressive. Those nonprofits are really trying to explicitly address either system change or the conditions of this system. So that's a much smaller slice of the nonprofit industrial complex. And so I guess the question is, what can we change in our own practices with the folks who are closest to us, who would be, either delighted donors or more enlightened donors, or just people who feel a stake in our work, which again is, I think, a smaller slice, because there's still lots of folks that are giving to Harvard and to their university, alma maters, in their estate giving and things like that, it'd be great if that actually went towards this smaller section of the nonprofit industrial complex, but it still feels like that's going to continue to go to those entities. So the one thing I think that in trying to think about resource mobilization and helping groups to think about their resource mobilization is how much time we could actually spend, even if it's like 10% or something of our time, on actually just trying to change the tax structure, educating people around like how much money actually our money goes into back into the tax system that should be redistributed also. But all that said, I guess I'm just trying to get perspective on, like, when I talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, it really is, what can we change within that huge field?
Oh, that's such a meaty question and such a good one. And Polly's going to go through sort of where we think the road needs to go, the top things as practitioners that we can do as individual practitioners. I think from a personal perspective, I think advocating and being part of larger nonprofit advocacy groups that actually advocate on behalf of the sector with the government about things like the tax code and postal rates and what qualifies as a 501c3 versus C4. Like, I used to have Team USA as a client in my nonprofit practice. Do you want to know how much the visa contract is with Team USA? Like, it's, it's one of those, the fact that we have the same 501c3 code governing that we do, the small food bank and, the division of Detroit Action, and it makes no sense. So I do think it's incumbent on all of us as people who are passionate about the Prometheus rooted potential for humanity and for this and for philanthropy in its truest sense, to be part of that advocacy voice. And we can certainly follow up with some of the groups that we as individuals are members of. I think that, Steve, you're totally right in that the progressive movement as it manifests in the nonprofit industrial complex is a special subset. I didn't start thinking about what this meant. I didn't grow up in the progressive space. I grew up in the healthcare space. So squarely in that help, hope, support, make your donors feel like heroes, all the things. And it never occurred to me to question that until much later. So I think for those of us who have the honor and privilege to teach students, to have interns, to raise fundraisers, giving them a more holistic view of the whole spectrum is critical. I don't think we do a good job of that. I think changing our sort of the professional structure around the nonprofit sector. So I find it very odd that when I worked in the heavily C3 space, I went to conferences like the nonprofit AMA, the American Marketing Association. I went to Black Bots conference. I went to, you know, those kinds of things. And now working with very hardcore progressive groups, there is nothing outside of maybe like Netroots Nation that does not have a lot of revenue generation content, great content, but not rev gen specific. That infrastructure to support the sector holistically isn't there. And that's something that we want very much to change. Because I do think that this cross continuum work is important. Steve, am I addressing some of the things that you've asked? It was such a meaty question. I want to make sure I hit all the aspects.
No, I just appreciate like realizing like, okay, it's not just one big monolith, right? We're our own microsystem in
Yes.
that, you know, when we think about most aligned to, you know, just awareness analysis of how we're almost awareness of like, okay, how can we're in the system, but how can we not be of the system?
Yep.
In that process, that there's a lot more people who, you know, we could be building kind of a practice around. Yeah, and the other thing I really appreciate you talking about in terms of like the spectrum and like groups that are softening the ground for a movement of systems change or, you know, wealth redistribution, that just thinking about the donors of color who may be recently middle class or maybe generations of middle class or maybe some accumulated wealth. I mean, they need that ground softened in a different way because the whole history of, you know, the way that philanthropy has, you know, been experienced in their family is very different.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is something, and I also would put a layer of, for those of the groups that we work with that are organizing like deep base members, when we talk about education and what independent revenue generation in our standpoint, so the money you make, you set yourself versus what you get from a foundation, like we get to work with a group of returning citizens that have a nonprofit here in Florida to organize fellow returning citizens in rural parts of Florida. And what the communication need has been of what do independent dollars do in terms of building the community, building the power. How is it, you know, how do you thread that needle between this is not, you know, you paying for your liberation, taking an active part in the civic engagement. And so it is definitely not a one size fits all ground softening. And there isn't enough out there yet. And it's something that, you know, we take as our charge to help change of what does it mean to look at revenue opportunities with your deep base, with your mass base, with donors of color versus white donors. And all of that means, because we also need to train, I think, white donors that are, you know, that very traditional 67-year-old white woman who is like the most common donor profile in this country, to it's not about the guilt, it's not about the help, hope, support. What does true allyship from a revenue generation standpoint mean? I'll brag on one of our grantees, Imagine Black. They have been incredibly blunt and forward about sort of the race mix in their donor base. So they actually have two membership programs. They have their Kinfolk program for their Black members, and they have their Accomplice program for their non-Black members. And they have said, here's what to be an accomplice means. It is not just being a donor. And here's the expectation of you as an ally in this fight for racial equality, in their case in Oregon. So I think that's where, you know, it's small but mighty, but we are starting to see those models emerge. So if you are ever interested in having those deeper conversations, or putting heads together and seeing how we as a group of nonprofits can be part of the systems change within our little micro ecosystem, call us. We are always happy to riff on that.
I think it's also important here to think about, like, you know, this is a bigger system, but we've all been inculcated into it, right? Like, we completely unconsciously participate. So what gets the headlines? What even makes us, people in the movement, doing the work? We know the machinery behind the fundraising beast, and Bezos gives $100 million, and we're like, whoa, that's a lot of money. It was like 0.5% of what he made the year that he gave that. And if you know, so we ourselves, you know, get all starry-eyed and big about the amount of money and how, oh, wow, I wish we could get a piece of that because we could do so much good with it. And we think about that perspective, but we don't stop and go, wait a minute. And I've done this purposefully as a fundraiser because I want to be part of change too, right? So I said, I have a donor who's on Social Security disability income, who gave 30% of his annual income to the organization I work for. When we can put out our annual report, I didn't spotlight the major donor who gave us the biggest gift, that was like sofa cushion money to them. I spotlighted the person who made the most painful, difficult for them financially gift. And that really big donor came to me later and said, I was ashamed of myself when I read that piece. And I think things that when we have the power to lift up other lenses, other ways to look at it, we can help put some cracks in the wall. That is the foundation of the nonprofit industrial complex.
I love that, Polly. All right. We have 20 minutes left, Polly. Tell us how to fix it.
No problem. So I think, so part of it was, you know, what I just sort of laid out, but we can also think about embracing a multi-entity work or partnerships. Build in, if you don't already have advocacy, why? I mean, is it mission, vision, values are always going to be first, but if you can do advocacy work, do it. If you can partner with those who are doing advocacy work, do it. Dismantling the systems of oppression are how we're going to get to change, not just providing a meal. Providing a meal that day is incredibly important. People got to eat, but let's get rid of the root causes too. And doing so, let's participate in pushing the those biases away against advocacy work. So when we do our things connected to the greater movement to social change, it doesn't hurt us. Most donors give to 5 or more organizations. It won't hurt your giving by lifting up another group's work too.
And I want to pause about the multi-entity piece. This is something that's really come prominently for the grantees that we work with directly, where they are exploring what do they need to actually do the work. So the complex is what it is, and making sure that you have the legal structures that give you the full power under the law to do your mission. So we have a lot of groups that started as C3s and have added C4s. We've had some that started as C4s and added PACs. We've got ones that have C3, C4 super PACs. We have a lot that are exploring LLCs right now to think about what other revenue generation possibilities there are for them. So just wanted to see if there's any desire to dig in there at all in future trainings, because that has exploded in our world over the last, I would say, 6 months. I know that's.
Are any of you folks thinking about doing a C4 PAC or another entity that you don't already have? James, you want to say anything about that?
I'll just say we are spinning off from a parent organization, California Calls, which has a C3 and C4. So we've recently gotten our C3 and want to create a C4 by the time we spin off at the end of the year.
Mhm. I was just going to mention that even formations that are maybe shared around a community, the Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco acts as a fiscal agent for several sort of community organizing and other community development 501c3s, and their Chinese for Affirmative Action has a C4 and C3. So I think even just having closer relationships where there's a lot more awareness of how, like the Asian Prisoner Support Committee's work impacts the C4 work at Chinese for Affirmative Action, and another organizing group among queer trans in the API community. All these, I think the closer people are to each other, they could see how they actually need each other in that work, and can advocate for supporting, having their donors support, the other groups too. So.
And Ursulia, you guys have a C3 and C4?
Yeah, and the C4 side does a lot of advocacy for like climate and criminal justice and stuff like that.
What organization are you with?
Move Texas.
Move Texas. Okay, awesome. For anybody who has environmental justice work in their umbrella, we have a webinar on June 15th that we will be announcing our third class of environmental justice applications being open. So so if you are interested in potentially joining us as a grantee, if you have EJ work in your portfolio, please reach out before that Wednesday webinar. Samuel, that's awesome. And Samuel, which group are you with?
I'm with the it's called the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, which is actually a part of the Institute of Environmental Science, which is at UCLA.
Okay, gotcha. Awesome. So if you have a C3 and C4, make sure that you guys are maximizing the actual work between the C3 and C4, so that like you're maximizing what you can pay for out of your C3 that you're not paying for out of your C4, what can be paid for with C3 dollars, all of those things. I think we probably will do a class between July and November, or July and December, on like the basics of C3 to C4 interaction, to make sure that all of the revenue you bring in is got as much capability as it can. So more to come on that. Holly, sorry, didn't mean to derail you.
No. So the other thing that we can do is, we talked about it already a little bit, is to tell our story right. And we did a whole presentation on this already on storytelling. Please revisit it. These are some of the hot takes that I think are really important, but it's about not participating in the way that we've been all taught to tell the story. So educate yourself on trauma-informed storytelling. Don't exploit the trauma to raise money off of it. We know that that is an approach that raises money, but we can be people focused, people centered, and not trauma centered in the way, or participate in trauma porn when we tell these stories. Include the solution or path forward, not just the emotional. Practice not leaving the hero is the donor. Make the hero the organization, or the hero the people that we're fighting for, or don't have a hero. Have the work stand out, and join people, invite people to join the movement to create change, rather than set them up as the leader because they wrote the check, the proverbial check. I think it's important to make sure that when you're doing storytelling, and we talked about this in that too, is that you have informed consent of the people's story that you're telling, and that as much as possible, have it even come from their own words, rather than using your, our fancy talking to turn it around and make it more palpable to dominant culture and the way that folks are used to hearing stories. The other way to sort of shift the conversation is check yourself. Make sure you're not acting like the savior yourself. Are you including the community that you seek to serve in setting up the systems to help them? That you're not imposing what you think is the best solution, but they're saying these are the solutions that we seek, and make sure that they have not only a seat at the table, but that their voices are heard.
And that goes for how we fundraise too. It is not just programmatically. So we as fundraisers, and that's who I'm assuming is largely who's on this call, think about the constituency you exist to serve. And that may be in some cases, scientists, that may be community members, that may be other nonprofit organizations, whatever you do, make sure that you have advisors that are members of the community you serve, who can be your gut check and who are willing to work in reciprocal partnership with you to make sure that your fundraising is always something that they can stand behind. That's a critical thing. We actually have an advisory council for that. So I highly recommend that as well.
I think it is hugely important to make sure that your partners are good ones. Advocating with your funders for payouts, participatory grant making. When you work with the fundraising philanthropic sector, you can have conversations. I know that we're all trained to be deferential to our program officers and to these really big foundations, but practice having those courageous conversations, like act as if you don't feel like you can that you can have those tough conversations, act as if you can, and have that when you have that opportunity. I'm not saying everybody's going to, but have the conversation about thanks so much. You can be grateful. It's gratitude is a beautiful thing. I'm not saying it's not, but then you can also say, this grant application was difficult for us for this reason. Lay it out. Sometimes people behave in ways that are problematic and difficult because they don't know they're problematic and difficult, and they need it to be pointed out to them. So if you feel like you have the personal agency to be able to speak up, do it. That's how we can put more chips in that wall.
Absolutely. And I think with the payouts, so Polly and I together make our funding decisions. It helps us when our applicants say, here is the full need. We can rarely cover the full need as an intermediary, but it helps us to then have that data to sit down with our program officer at Forward and say, these are the kinds of demands our grantee partners have. And I don't mean demands in a bad way, but here's how underfunded this work is. So having those candid conversations is part of making partners better across the complex. And it's not, screaming at your program officer about how much the 5% payout rule from 1969 sucks. It's having the conversations, like having, the data to say, here's the full need. What can you do? Can I be part of conversations up the chain that would loosen up more money to fund this work now? Asking your funders about their approach to participatory grant making. That is something that we are starting here at Progressive Multiplier, actually with the new class of environmental justice grantees. So we actually went and sought funding to stipend our first class, so they will serve as peer mentors and participate in the grant making process for our third class of EJ grantees. And that idea came from the grantees, not us, because they're like, we want to have a say in what we learn next. So advocating and really opening up your partner's eyes, because I agree with Polly, 90% of the time, people aren't jerks, because they have made the decision to be, or they aren't short-sighted. It's just, they literally don't know. And I know that threads the uncomfortable line of, it shouldn't be on us to educate, especially for communities that have been traditionally disenfranchised. But where you can use your voice to start making chips in that wall and gum up the complex a little bit, this is a great place to do it. Holly, you want to bring us home?
So, diversifying revenue streams lets you do more. The more smaller donors you have blunts the impact that those larger foundations make on your ability to do things. Their restrictions inhibit you to do stuff. Small donors or funding without restrictions allow you to be like, so what, right? So what we aim to do in our work is to deal very directly with the structural problem that the donor class has put upon us. And this quote that Bethany was able to capture for us has been really resonating for us both. But relying on the benevolence of the donor class is a structural problem when we're building community power. So by diversifying revenue streams, that donor class that has gotten in our way, that has created some of the very laws that have put up all those roadblocks, that their power disappears, allowing us to build up our community's power and to have a greater voice, and I let their voices shine too. So this takes us all the way back, in my opinion, to Prometheus, and who brought us our fire and gives us the capacity to hope. And we can take, we can get beyond the whole concept of the nonprofit industrial complex, even though it exists and is impacted on us today. But we can use that fire and that hope to help deconstruct those walls, use whatever tools that we have to change the way that we do philanthropy, the way that we do our work every day, so that we can become more effective and hopefully change this system so it becomes, that industrial complex becomes less powerful.
All right, guys, we have 5 minutes left. Thank you, Polly. Any parting questions before we prep for our next class? We answered all your burning tax code questions and history of nonprofit and Greek mythology and all the things. The slides will be available. It usually takes a day or 2 to get them up there, but we put the recording as well as the PDF on the Resilience Initiative portal. If you don't have access or have any trouble, just reach out. We can send them to you.
Can I ask, I've attended some of the deep dive sessions for more of the training sessions. And I guess, can you shed some light on what you're anticipating for the deep dive for this?
Kate, you teed us up, man. I love it. So what we want to get into for the deep dive, and we are totally flexible on this thought, was ask everyone to bring where their biggest challenge in their current job is with running into the nonprofit industrial complex, so that we can actually do some deep dive conversations about those use cases. And I was going to start us off with like Progressive Multiplier's biggest, and really sort of crowdsource possible solutions. Does that sound valuable, or is there another approach that would be better? Kate, any thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question reading this is, I don't know, a little bit more practical, which is like, I'm a fundraiser, I'm here. My executive director and my finance officer are not here. How, but they're going to want to know about my numbers. And yeah, so I guess I'd be interested in kind of discussing, does it have to come with sort of acceptance of lower numbers? Does it, is it something we can implement gradually? How do you onboard board members or staff, that kind of thing?
Yep. So if that is the desire of the group, we can definitely run that as like let's start with, okay, I'm a fundraiser. how do I deal with this with my executive director, with my finance director? What does this look like to pivot over, you know, multiple cycles to a more ethical way of fundraising? How do we, you know, actually entrench folks in our kind of anti-complex way of fundraising? We can totally make it a practicum session. That's 100% fine with us. Does that resonate with the group? And Steve, I would love nonprofits talking taxes. So we can definitely, I'm thinking, Kate, how about we run that use case up front and then open the floor up? Does that sound good? Sort of combine the two approaches?
Yeah, or, you know, start with what you have here and then, yeah, I don't know. But I do think both would be interesting.
Okay, cool. Because I always want to make sure that everybody walks away like better prepared to fundraise in whatever thing we've been talking about, whether it's a big systemic change or like something nitty gritty, like who's management of your mid-level donors. So we want to make sure that they're really practical advice. We knew we needed to spend this time kind of rooting in the understanding, but we want to get down to the brass tacks, so to speak.
No, and just to put another little plug about you know how we can be change makers. Just because it exists, it has existed, that the way that we talk, the way that we, you know, maybe put trauma forward, and the way it doesn't necessarily mean that talking differently is going to mean less money. It's just that sometimes we're afraid of trying to talk differently. So one of the nice things about what we try to promote is testing talking, or you can just try talking differently without necessarily testing it, so that you just because and this might be antithetical to, you know, what we pitch normally, but if you test and say, you know, being exploitative in our nature raises us more money than not being exploitative, may just sort of set you up for having to continue to be exploitative if you haven't won over your executive director in your finance office. But if you do an appeal that's non-exploitative and it does okay, then you can just be like, yeah, we did well. Look, we don't have to exploit it in the way that we use language.
Yes, and testing is definitely a part of this, Kate, to your point of how do you evolve. So, because the data always wins. So you guys know I'm a geek. All right, I want to respect everybody's time. We are a minute over. Thank you so much for the great discussion and for being willing to have the conversation. And I hope everybody can come back for the second half of it. And hopefully we will have some more of our typical alumni who are here. And we can really dig deep. So Polly and I have our marching orders for what you guys want for next time. But if you have any thoughts and ideas about next session or July through December sessions, please holler so that we aren't flying blind. That would be much appreciated. And yes, definitely, Steve, anything you are willing to share on this topic, that would be hugely helpful. So thanks all, have wonderful weekends, and we will talk soon. Take care.